The wind howled like a living thing, tearing through the Colorado Rockies with a fury that could kill. Sarah Mitchell felt her legs give out beneath her as she collapsed into the snow for the third time in an hour. Her lips were blue, her fingers numb beyond feeling, and with each labored breath, white vapor escaped into the bitter night air. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. Leave me here to die. But Marcus Chun didn't even pause. Without a word, he swept her into his arms and continued walking into the blizzard that meteorologists would later call the worst Colorado had seen in 50 years. What he didn't know was that he had 19 miles left to go. What she didn't know was that this moment would change everything they thought they knew about survival, about sacrifice, and about the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of human endurance. This is their story. The morning had started like any other October day in Boulder County. Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old wildlife photographer from Denver, packed her camera equipment into her Jeep Wrangler with the methodical precision she'd learned during her 5 years documenting Colorado's wilderness. The weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect conditions for capturing the autumn aspen groves she'd been commissioned to photograph for National Geographic. Marcus Chun had different reasons for being in the mountains. That day, a 32-year-old emergency room physician at Denver General, he'd taken his first day off in 3 months to clear his head after a particularly brutal stretch of 12-hour shifts. His plan was simple: a solo hike up the Rabbit Creek Trail to decompress and maybe catch some trout in the alpine lakes he'd heard about from his hiking group. Neither of them expected their paths to cross that morning at the Thunder Lake trailhead parking lot, and neither of them could have predicted that a sudden weather system moving in from the northwest would trap them in a fight for their lives. Sarah arrived first, pulling into the gravel lot just as the sun crested the peaks to the east. She'd been to this location twice before, but never this late in the season. The aspen leaves were at their peak, brilliant golds and oranges that seemed to glow in the morning light. She spent 20 minutes organizing her gear, checking her camera batteries, and reviewing the trail map she'd downloaded to her phone. The hike to her intended shooting location would take about 4 hours round trip, giving her plenty of time to capture the shots she needed and return before dark. Marcus arrived 15 minutes later, parking his Honda Pilot 3 spaces away from Sarah's Jeep. He noticed her immediately, not because he was looking for company, but because she was the only other person in the lot at 7:30 on a Wednesday morning. Most day hikers didn't start this early, and most photographers didn't venture this far into the backcountry alone. He respected that kind of independence. Their first interaction was brief and polite. Sarah was adjusting her backpack straps when Marcus walked past on his way to the trailhead. "Beautiful morning for it," he said, nodding toward the mountain peaks. "Perfect light," Sarah agreed, hefting her camera bag. "You heading up Rabbit Creek? That's the plan, you?" "Thunder Lake. Should be some incredible shots up there today." They walked the first half-mile together, their conversation flowing easily despite being strangers. Marcus learned that Sarah had grown up in Fort Collins and had been hiking Colorado's trails since she was 12. Sarah discovered that Marcus had moved to Denver from Portland 3 years earlier for his medical residency and was still exploring the state's wilderness areas in his limited free time. At the trail junction, where their paths would diverge, they exchanged brief goodbyes and headed in opposite directions. Sarah took the western fork toward Thunder Lake, while Marcus continued north toward the Rabbit Creek drainage. Both expected to be back at their vehicles by mid-afternoon. The weather began to change around 11. Clock. Sarah was positioned on a rocky outcrop overlooking Thunder Lake, adjusting her telephoto lens to capture a family of elk grazing in the distant meadow when she noticed the wind picking up. The morning's calm had given way to gusts that made her tripod shake, forcing her to weight it down with her backpack. She glanced at the sky and saw high, thin clouds moving in from the west, nothing that seemed immediately threatening. 3 miles away, Marcus was having similar thoughts as he worked his way up the Rabbit Creek Valley. The wind was making it harder to cast his fishing line with precision, and the temperature had dropped noticeably since morning. He checked his watch and decided to give the fishing another hour before heading back. By noon, both of them realized something was seriously wrong. The clouds had thickened dramatically, turning from wispy white to an ominous gray-black that seemed to swallow the mountain peaks. The wind had increased to a steady howl punctuated by gusts that could knock a person off balance. Most concerning of all, the temperature was dropping fast. Sarah estimated it had fallen at least 20 degrees in the past hour. Sarah packed her camera equipment carefully, knowing that a rush job now could mean damaged gear later. She'd been in sudden weather changes before, but nothing quite like this. The storm seemed to be intensifying by the minute, and she was still 3 miles from the trailhead. Marcus was facing an even more challenging situation. He'd hiked further up the valley than originally planned, drawn by a series of promising pools where the creek wound through a narrow canyon. Now he was nearly 5 miles from his starting point, with increasingly difficult terrain between him and safety. The snow started at 12:47 p.m., not the gentle flakes of an early winter dusting, but hard, driving pellets that stung exposed skin and reduced visibility to mere yards. Within minutes, the world around both hikers transformed from autumn gold to winter white. Sarah moved as quickly as she dared down the Thunder Lake Trail, but the rocks that had been dry and stable in the morning were now becoming slick with accumulating snow. Her hiking boots, adequate for dry conditions, weren't designed for this kind of weather. She could feel her body temperature dropping despite her exertion. Marcus faced an even steeper descent, with loose scree slopes that were treacherous under normal conditions and potentially deadly with snow cover. He'd changed his plan, abandoning any hope of fishing and focusing entirely on getting back to the parking lot safely. His medical training kicked in as he monitored his own condition, early signs of hypothermia that he recognized from textbook descriptions, but had never experienced firsthand. The storm reached full fury around 2 o'clock. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet in the driving snow. The wind created whiteout conditions that made it impossible to see trail markers or familiar landmarks. Both hikers were now relying on their GPS devices and hoping the batteries would last long enough to guide them to safety. Sarah's phone showed she was still 2 miles from the trailhead when she took her first serious fall. Her foot slipped on a snow-covered root, and she went down hard, landing on her right hip and sliding several feet down a slope before catching herself on a boulder. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and when she tried to stand, sharp pain shot through her leg. She sat in the snow for several minutes, assessing the damage. Her hip was badly bruised, and her right ankle had twisted in the fall. She could walk, but not without significant pain and a pronounced limp. More concerning was her overall condition. Her fingers were becoming numb, and she could feel her core temperature continuing to drop. Marcus was dealing with his own crisis at almost the same moment. The GPS trail he'd been following had become completely obscured by snow, and he'd taken what he thought was a shortcut that had actually led him further from the main trail. He was lost in a whiteout with rapidly deteriorating conditions and no clear sense of direction. His medical training told him that panic was his greatest enemy. He forced himself to stop, take shelter behind a large pine tree, and reassess his situation rationally. His phone showed weak signal strength, but was still picking up GPS satellites. According to the device, he was approximately 3 miles from the parking lot, but the route would require navigating terrain he couldn't see in the storm. The critical moment came at 3:15 p.m. When their paths crossed again in the most unlikely of circumstances, Sarah had been struggling down what she thought was the main trail for over an hour, her progress hampered by her injured ankle and the increasingly deep snow. The pain in her leg was getting worse, and hypothermia was beginning to affect her judgment. She'd been moving in what felt like circles, unable to locate the familiar landmarks that should have guided her back to the trailhead. She was resting against a tree, trying to conserve energy and warmth, when she heard something over the wind, a human voice calling out. At first she thought it might be her imagination, a trick of the storm, but then she heard it again. "Hello, is someone there?" She called back with as much volume as she could muster. "Here, I'm here." Through the swirling snow, a figure emerged, tall, wearing a dark jacket, moving carefully through the drifts. It was Marcus, looking as relieved to see her as she was to see him. "Sarah?" he said, recognizing her despite the conditions. "What are you doing out here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, managing a weak smile. "I think we're both lost." Marcus quickly assessed her condition with his medical training. Her lips were blue, she was shivering uncontrollably, and she was clearly favoring her right leg. These were serious warning signs in conditions like this. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. "Since this morning, same as you. But I fell about an hour ago, hurt my ankle." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus checked his GPS device and compared it with hers. They were both showing approximately the same location, still nearly 2 miles from the parking lot, but at least now they had a better sense of direction. "We need to move," he said. "Both of us are showing signs of hypothermia, and it's going to get dark in a few hours." They started walking together, Marcus supporting Sarah's weight on her injured side. Their progress was painfully slow, but steady. Having another person made an enormous psychological difference. Neither was facing the storm alone anymore, but after 30 minutes of difficult travel, Sarah's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. The combination of her injury, the cold, and her extended exposure to the elements was taking its toll. Her speech became slurred, and she was having trouble concentrating. Marcus recognized these as advanced signs of hypothermia. "Sarah, we need to find shelter," he said. "You need to get warm." They found a partially protected area beneath a large boulder overhang, where Marcus used his emergency space blanket to create a windbreak. He shared his remaining energy bars and hot tea from his thermos, trying to get calories and warmth into Sarah's system. But as they sat there, both of them realized the gravity of their situation. The storm showed no signs of letting up. They were still miles from safety. Darkness was approaching, and Sarah was in no condition to continue hiking on her own. The temperature continued to plummet, and Marcus knew that spending the night in these conditions without proper gear would likely be fatal for both of them. "We have to keep moving," he said finally. "It's our only chance." Sarah tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. The hypothermia had progressed to the point where her body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve her core temperature. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Marcus, I can't make it." That's when she said the words that would haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. "Leave me here to die." Marcus stared at Sarah for a long moment, snow accumulating on his jacket as the wind howled around their makeshift shelter. Her words hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything he'd sworn to uphold as a physician. Leave her here to die. The logical part of his brain understood her reasoning. 2 people dying was worse than 1, and her chances of survival were diminishing by the minute. But Marcus Chun had spent 3 years in emergency medicine, watching people fight impossible odds. He'd seen patients survive traumatic injuries that should have killed them, witnessed recoveries that defied medical explanation, and learned never to give up on someone while they were still breathing. "No," he said simply, and without another word. He swept Sarah into his arms. She weighed maybe 125 pounds, but with her winter gear and waterlogged clothing, Marcus estimated he was carrying closer to 140. Under normal conditions, that wouldn't have been a problem for someone who ran 5 miles every morning and spent his weekends rock climbing. But these weren't normal conditions. He was already hypothermic himself. They were at an altitude of over 9,000 feet, and he had to navigate treacherous terrain in near-zero visibility. Sarah protested weakly as he adjusted his grip, securing her against his chest in a fireman's carry position that would distribute her weight most efficiently across his shoulders and back. "Marcus, you can't," she mumbled, her words slurred by hypothermia. "You'll die too." He didn't respond because he was already walking, placing each step carefully in the deep snow, using his trekking poles to test the ground ahead. His GPS showed they were 1.8 miles from the parking lot, but the device couldn't account for the reality of their situation, the detours around impassable terrain, the energy required to break trail through knee-deep drifts, or the fact that he was now carrying another human being. The first quarter mile was the hardest Doc Marcus had to find. His rhythm, learning to balance Sarah's weight while maintaining his footing on increasingly treacherous ground. His back muscles, already strained from hours of hiking in difficult conditions, began to burn with the additional load. But he forced himself to focus on the immediate task, the next step, the next breath, the next 20 feet of progress. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her body conserving energy by shutting down unnecessary functions. During her lucid moments, she tried to convince Marcus to leave her, but he'd learned to recognize the pattern and simply kept walking. Her hypothermia was severe enough that her judgment was compromised. She couldn't make rational decisions about her own survival. By 4 o'clock, they'd covered perhaps half a mile, and Marcus was beginning to understand the true scope of his challenge. At this pace, it would take him 3 hours to reach the parking lot, assuming he could maintain this speed, which was becoming increasingly doubtful. His legs were already trembling with fatigue, and he'd consumed most of his remaining water and energy bars. The storm seemed to sense their vulnerability and intensified its assault. Wind gusts now exceeded 40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally and creating whiteout conditions that made navigation nearly impossible. Marcus was relying entirely on his GPS, stopping every few minutes to check their bearing and ensure he wasn't wandering off course. During one of these stops, he made a critical decision that would save both their lives. Instead of following the official trail, which wound through a series of switchbacks designed to minimize elevation change, Marcus chose a more direct route down a steep drainage that led toward the valley floor. It was dangerous loose rocks hidden beneath the snow, potential cliff drops, and no established path to follow. But it would cut at least half a mile off their journey. The descent began gradually, but soon Marcus found himself navigating slopes that would have been challenging without carrying another person. He used his trekking poles for balance and tested each step carefully, knowing that a single fall could be fatal for both of them. Sarah's condition stabilized somewhat during this period, possibly because Marcus's body heat was helping to warm her, or perhaps because her hypothermia had reached a plateau. She became more alert, occasionally murmuring directions or warnings about obstacles she could see from her position. "Tree branch ahead," she whispered during one particularly difficult stretch. 2 feet to your right. Rock outcrop coming up. Can you go around it? These small contributions became invaluable to Marcus, giving him information he couldn't gather himself while focusing on maintaining his footing and conserving energy. The drainage strategy worked initially, allowing them to make better time while staying on course toward the parking area. But after another half mile, they encountered an obstacle that hadn't shown up on the GPS, a steep ravine carved by years of snowmelt, with walls too high to climb around and a bottom that disappeared into darkness. Marcus stood at the edge, breathing heavily, feeling the burn in his shoulders and back from carrying Sarah for over an hour. His GPS showed they were approximately 1 mile from safety, but this ravine represented a potentially insurmountable barrier. "Can you see a way across?" Sarah asked, her voice stronger than it had been since the storm began. Marcus studied their options. The ravine was perhaps 30 feet wide at its narrowest point, with a series of large boulders creating a natural bridge about 50 yards to their left. But reaching those boulders would require a dangerous traverse across loose scree, and crossing them while carrying Sarah would be extremely risky. "There might be a way," he said, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The traverse took 20 minutes and required every ounce of his remaining strength. The scree slope was unstable, with rocks shifting beneath his feet and threatening to send both of them tumbling into the ravine. Marcus was forced to move in short bursts, advancing a few feet at a time and stopping to regain his balance before continuing. Sarah remained perfectly still during these movements, understanding instinctively that any shift in her position could throw off Marcus's balance at a critical moment. Her trust in his abilities was absolute, even as she could feel his body trembling with exhaustion beneath her. The boulder crossing was even more treacherous. Each stone was covered with a slick layer of snow and ice, and the gaps between them were wide enough that Marcus had to leap from one to the next while maintaining his grip on Sarah. If he'd been hiking alone, it would have been a reasonable challenge. Carrying another person, it bordered on impossible. On the third boulder, Marcus's right foot slipped. For a terrifying moment, both of them were falling toward the rocky bottom of the ravine. But Marcus's left hand caught the edge of the stone, his fingers finding a crack in the granite that provided just enough grip to arrest their fall. The sudden stop wrenched his shoulder and sent shooting pains through his back. But they were alive. Sarah was fully conscious now, adrenaline cutting through her hypothermia-induced confusion. "Marcus, are you okay?" He couldn't answer immediately because he was using all his strength to pull them back onto the boulder. His shoulder felt damaged, not dislocated, but strained beyond its normal limits. When he finally regained secure footing, he had to rest for several minutes before continuing. "Half a mile," he said, checking his GPS with shaking hands. "We're half a mile out." But those final 2,640 feet proved to be the most difficult of their entire ordeal. Marcus's body was approaching complete exhaustion. His quadriceps were cramping, his back was spasming, and his shoulder injury was limiting his range of motion. He'd been carrying Sarah for nearly 2 hours through some of the most challenging terrain in Colorado, and his energy reserves were depleted. The snow had deepened to over 18 inches in many areas, forcing Marcus to lift his legs high with each step and creating enormous additional strain on his already overtaxed muscles. His pace slowed to a crawl, perhaps 1 mile per hour, and he began to doubt whether he could complete the journey. Sarah recognized his deteriorating condition and tried to help in whatever way she could. When they reached areas with less snow accumulation, she convinced him to put her down so she could attempt to walk on her own. Her ankle was still injured and her hypothermia remained serious, but she managed to cover short distances with Marcus's support. These brief respites allowed Marcus to recover some strength, but they also revealed how much damage the extended carry had done to his body. His back was locked in spasm, his shoulders felt like they were on fire, and he was showing his own signs of advanced hypothermia, confusion, clumsiness, and slurred speech. By 5:30 p.m., darkness was beginning to fall, and they were still a quarter mile from the parking area. Marcus knew that their survival margin was measured in minutes now, not hours. Neither of them had adequate cold weather gear for an overnight stay, and their body temperatures were dropping toward levels that would cause organ failure. But the knowledge that they were close, so tantalizingly close, gave him the motivation to continue. The final push required everything Marcus had left. Sarah was unconscious again, her body having exhausted its ability to generate heat. Marcus carried her through snow that was now nearly 2 feet deep in places, guided only by the small screen of his GPS device and the fading light of what had been the longest day of his life. He began talking to Sarah during this final stretch, partly to keep her responsive, but mostly to maintain his own focus and determination. "We're going to make it," he told her repeatedly. 200 yards, 100 yards, 50 yards. When the parking lot finally came into view through the swirling snow, Marcus felt a surge of emotion that nearly overwhelmed him. Both vehicles were still there, covered with snow, but intact. But his ordeal wasn't over yet. He still had to get Sarah warm and get both of them to medical attention. His Jeep was closer, and Marcus managed to dig out the driver's side door and get the engine started. The heater began pumping warm air immediately, and he positioned Sarah in the passenger seat with the vents directed at her core. Her skin was frighteningly pale, and her pulse was weak but steady. Marcus's own condition was deteriorating rapidly now that the immediate crisis had passed. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the final miles was wearing off, and his body was shutting down. His hands were shaking so severely that he could barely operate his cell phone to call for emergency assistance. The call to 911 was brief and urgent. 2 hikers with severe hypothermia at the Thunder Lake trailhead. Immediate medical evacuation required. While they waited for the ambulance, Marcus used every piece of survival knowledge he possessed to stabilize both of them. He found an emergency blanket in his hiking pack and wrapped it around Sarah, then positioned himself next to her to share body heat. He forced himself to stay awake and alert, monitoring her breathing and pulse while fighting his own exhaustion. The ambulance arrived 37 minutes later, followed by a rescue team from Boulder County Search and Rescue. The paramedics immediately recognized the severity of their condition and began aggressive rewarming protocols while preparing them for transport to Denver General Hospital. As they loaded Sarah into the ambulance, she regained consciousness briefly and looked directly at Marcus. "You carried me," she whispered, her eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You actually carried me." Marcus managed an exhausted smile. "I told you we were going to make it." The hospital stay that followed would last 3 days for both of them. Sarah's hypothermia had progressed to a dangerous stage, and she required intensive warming procedures and monitoring for cardiac complications. Her ankle fracture needed surgical repair, but it would heal completely within 6 weeks. Marcus had sustained significant soft tissue injuries to his back and shoulders, along with his own case of moderate hypothermia. The doctors were amazed that he'd been able to carry another person for over 2 hours in sub-zero conditions while suffering from cold exposure himself. The meteorologist confirmed that the storm had been unprecedented for the region, a sudden convergence of weather systems that produced blizzard conditions with less than 2 hours warning. Wind speeds had exceeded 50 miles per hour, and the temperature had dropped 45 degrees in 6 hours. 3 other hikers in different areas of the Rockies had died that day, unable to reach safety before the storm overwhelmed them. But Sarah Mitchell and Marcus Cheyne had survived, bound together now by an experience that transcended normal human connection. What Marcus had done went beyond heroism or medical duty. It was an act of pure human compassion that had saved both their lives. The story could have ended there, in the hospital rooms where they recovered from their ordeal. But what happened next would prove that their journey through the storm was only the beginning of something much larger and more profound than either of them could have imagined. The investigation began 3 days after their rescue, when Boulder County Search and Rescue Chief Amanda Rodriguez visited Marcus and Sarah in their hospital rooms. What she discovered would challenge everything the rescue community thought they knew about survival in extreme conditions. "I need to understand exactly what happened out there," Rodriguez said, settling into the chair beside Marcus's bed. "Because According to our GPS tracking and weather data, what you accomplished should have been impossible. Rodriguez had been leading mountain rescues for 15 years, and she'd seen the aftermath of storms, like the one that had trapped Marcus and Sarah. Experienced mountaineers with proper gear had died in similar conditions. Solo hikers caught in sudden weather changes rarely survived without immediate rescue. And carrying another person for multiple miles through a blizzard? That simply didn't happen in real life, but the evidence was undeniable. The GPS logs from both their phones showed the exact route they'd taken, complete with timestamps that documented their movement through the storm. Weather station data confirmed the severity of conditions they'd faced. Hospital records proved the extent of their injuries and hypothermia. Most remarkably, Marcus's fitness tracker had recorded his physical exertion throughout the data that would later be studied by sports medicine researchers trying to understand the limits of human endurance. The device shows your heart rate spiked to 180 beats per minute during the ravine crossing, Rodriguez explained, studying the readout on her tablet. You maintained an average rate of 145 for over 2 hours while carrying. Sarah, that's the kind of sustained cardiovascular output we see in elite athletes during competition. Except you were doing it at altitude, in sub-zero temperatures, while hypothermic. Marcus listened to these details with a mixture of curiosity and detachment. The numbers seemed abstract compared to his memory of the experience, the burning in his muscles, the weight of Sarah in his arms, the desperate focus required to place one foot in front of the other. I wasn't thinking about heart rates, he said. I was just trying to get us home. But Rodriguez's investigation revealed that Marcus's accomplishment went far beyond simple determination. The route he'd chosen, despite being more dangerous than the established trail, had actually been optimal given their circumstances. His decision to descend through the drainage had saved them at least 40 minutes of travel time. That could have meant the difference between life and death. The ravine crossing that had nearly killed them both had also been the right choice. The official trail crossed the same ravine further upstream, but at that location, the storm had created conditions that would have been impassable. Marcus had unknowingly selected the only viable route to safety. You made decisions out there that a trained rescue professional would make, Rodriguez told him. But you did it while suffering from hypothermia, carrying another person, and navigating terrain you'd never seen before. That suggests an intuitive understanding of mountain survival that can't be taught. The media attention began while they were still in the hospital. A local news reporter had picked up the story from emergency scanner traffic, and by the second day, journalists from 3 states were requesting interviews. The narrative was irresistible. A doctor risking his life to save a stranger. An impossible journey through a killer storm. 2 people overcoming insurmountable odds through courage and determination. Sarah was uncomfortable with the attention, but she understood its value. Her experience as a National Geographic photographer had taught her how powerful stories could inspire others and raise awareness about important issues. She agreed to a single television interview with the condition that Marcus would participate, and that the focus would be on wilderness safety rather than sensationalism. The interview, conducted in the hospital's family conference room, became a watershed moment for both of them. People are calling Marcus a hero, the reporter said, directing her question to Sarah. How do you respond to that? Sarah looked at Marcus before answering, and something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. Hero is the wrong word, she said finally. What Marcus did was make a choice that any decent person would make. He saw someone who needed help, and he helped. The extraordinary part wasn't his decision, it was his refusal to give up when everything seemed impossible. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The hero narrative bothered him because it suggested his actions had been somehow superhuman, when the reality was that he'd simply done what his training and instincts had demanded. I think we focus too much on the dramatic aspects of survival. Stories, he said. The real lesson here isn't about carrying someone through a blizzard. It's about preparation, decision-making, and understanding that in the mountains, you're responsible not just for yourself, but for anyone else who might need help. The interview resonated far beyond Colorado's borders. Within a week, video clips were circulating on social media platforms, generating millions of views and thousands of comments from people sharing their own survival stories. Outdoor gear companies began reaching out, offering sponsorship deals and consulting opportunities. Publishers inquired about book rights, but the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Manning, director of the Wilderness Medicine Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Manning had been studying the physiological and psychological factors that enable some people to survive extreme situations while others perish. Marcus and Sarah's case represented a rare opportunity to examine these factors in controlled conditions, with detailed medical data and GPS tracking that documented every aspect of their ordeal. What we're seeing here challenges several fundamental assumptions about human performance under stress, Dr. Manning explained during their first meeting at Denver General. The conventional wisdom is that hypothermia rapidly degrades cognitive function and physical capability. But Marcus demonstrated enhanced decision-making ability even as his core temperature dropped below normal levels. The research project that emerged from this collaboration would span 3 years and involve institutions across the country. Marcus and Sarah underwent extensive testing, psychological evaluations, physical assessments, brain imaging studies, and simulated stress scenarios, designed to understand what had enabled their survival. The findings surprised even the researchers. Marcus possessed several physiological advantages that had contributed to his performance during the rescue. His cardiovascular fitness was in the top 5% of his age group, but more importantly, his body showed unusual efficiency in oxygen utilization at altitude. His muscle fibers contained higher than normal concentrations of mitochondria, the cellular structures responsible for energy production, which allowed him to sustain intense physical effort for extended periods. But the psychological factors proved even more significant. Testing revealed that Marcus had an extremely high tolerance for uncertainty and stress, combined with an unusual ability to maintain focus on immediate goals while suppressing awareness of larger dangers. These traits, the researchers concluded, were probably what had allowed him to continue carrying Sarah, even when rational analysis would have suggested the task was impossible. Sarah's case was equally intriguing. Her survival despite severe hypothermia appeared to be linked to several factors: her smaller body size, which lost heat more slowly than average, a psychological resilience developed during years of solo wilderness photography, and perhaps most importantly, her implicit trust in Marcus's abilities. There's a documented phenomenon in survival psychology called beneficial dependency, Dr. Manning explained. When someone's survival depends entirely on another person's actions, their body sometimes responds by conserving energy and reducing stress responses. Sarah's hypothermia actually protected her in some ways, slowing her metabolism and extending the time window for rescue. The research attracted international attention, leading to invitations for Marcus and Sarah to speak at medical conferences, wilderness education seminars, and survival training programs. They found themselves becoming advocates for wilderness safety education and emergency preparedness, roles neither had sought but both embraced. 6 months after the storm, they returned to the Thunder Lake trailhead together. It was a clear April morning, with patches of snow still visible on the high peaks, but warm sunshine filling the valley. Sarah carried a new camera gift from National Geographic to replace the equipment damaged during their ordeal, while Marcus brought a detailed topographic map and GPS unit to retrace their route. The return journey was emotional for both of them. They could see clearly now the terrain that had been hidden by the blizzard, understand the full scope of the challenges they'd faced, and appreciate how close they'd come to disaster. The ravine that had nearly killed them was even more impressive. In daylight, a 30-foot chasm with steep walls and jagged rocks at the bottom. The boulder crossing that Marcus had navigated while carrying Sarah looked impossibly dangerous. "I can't believe you made it across this," Sarah said, studying the gap between stones. "I can barely see how to do it without carrying someone." But the most powerful moment came when they reached the spot where Sarah had collapsed and whispered those fateful words, "Leave me here to die." They stood there in silence for several minutes, each remembering that critical moment when everything had hung in the balance. The decision Marcus had made in that instant had changed both their lives in ways they were still discovering. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if ... Sarah began, then stopped. "If I'd left you?" Marcus finished. "Every day. But not because I regret the choice. I wonder because I realize now that it wasn't really a choice at all. I couldn't have done anything else." Their relationship had evolved during the months since the rescue. What had begun as shared trauma had deepened into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and an understanding that few people could comprehend. They weren't romantic partners, both were clear about that, but they were connected by an experience that transcended normal human relationships. The speaking engagements they did together became increasingly popular, partly because their dynamic was so compelling. Sarah brought the photographer's eye for detail and storytelling, while Marcus provided the medical perspective and analytical framework. Together, they could communicate both the emotional impact and practical lessons of their experience. Their message was consistent. Wilderness adventures required preparation, respect for conditions, and acceptance of responsibility for others. But they also emphasized that survival wasn't just about gear and training. It was about making difficult decisions under pressure and refusing to give up when circumstances seemed impossible. The impact of their story extended far beyond the outdoor community. Emergency medical services began incorporating their case study into training programs, using the GPS and physiological data to teach paramedics about hypothermia treatment and rescue decision-making. Military survival schools analyzed Marcus's route selection and energy management strategies. Sports psychologists studied their mental preparation techniques, but perhaps the most significant legacy was less tangible. The thousands of people who heard their story and took wilderness safety more seriously, who carried better emergency equipment, who looked out for fellow hikers, or who simply refused to give up when facing their own impossible challenges. A year after the storm, Sarah received a letter from a woman in Montana whose husband had survived a heart attack on a remote hiking trail because she'd remembered Sarah and Marcus's emphasis on emergency preparedness. She'd carried a satellite communicator that enabled her to call for help, and her husband's life had been saved. Marcus heard from a search and rescue volunteer in New Hampshire who credited their story with giving him the determination to continue a difficult night rescue in freezing rain. The hiker he'd saved was a father of 3 who might not have made it home without that extra effort. These connections, the ripple effects of their experience, became the most meaningful aspect of their survival story. They'd learned that the real measure of their ordeal wasn't the distance Marcus had carried Sarah or the severity of conditions they'd endured. It was the inspiration their story provided to others facing their own storms, their own moments when giving up seemed like the only rational choice. Standing together at the Thunder Lake trailhead that April morning, looking up at the peaks where they'd nearly died, both Marcus and Sarah understood that their journey through the blizzard had been just the beginning. The real adventure, the impact they could have on other people's lives, was still unfolding. The mountain had tested them and found them worthy, not just of survival, but of something greater, the opportunity to help others discover their own capacity for courage, determination, and the refusal to leave anyone behind. 2 years after the storm that changed their lives, Marcus Chun received a phone call that would test everything he'd learned about human resilience in ways he never expected. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. As an emergency physician, Marcus was accustomed to late-night calls, but this one came from halfway around the world, a satellite phone transmission from somewhere in the Himalayas. "Dr. Chun? This is Base Camp Manager Jennifer Walsh at Everest South Call. We have a situation here, and we need your expertise." The story that unfolded over the crackling satellite connection would have seemed impossible to Marcus before his own experience in the Colorado blizzard. A climbing team of 6 had been caught in an unexpected storm at 26,000 feet higher than commercial aircraft fly, in conditions where human life could be measured in minutes rather than hours. "We have 2 climbers down," Walsh continued. "One with severe altitude sickness, another with what appears to be a compound leg fracture. The team leader is requesting permission to leave them and continue to the summit. He's saying it's the only way to save the rest of the group." Marcus felt a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the Colorado winter outside his Denver apartment. He was being asked to provide medical consultation for a situation that mirrored his own experience, but under conditions that made the Thunder Lake storm seem mild by comparison. "What's the weather window looking like?" Marcus asked, already reaching for his laptop to pull up the meteorological data for the region. "Deteriorating fast. We might have 6 hours of stable conditions, maybe 8 if we're lucky. After that, sustained winds over 60 miles per hour and visibility near zero." The parallels were unsettling. Another impossible choice between individual survival and group survival. Another situation where leaving someone behind seemed like the rational decision. Another test of the fundamental question that had haunted Marcus since that day in the mountains. When do you fight the impossible, and when do you accept defeat? But this time, Marcus wasn't making the choice for himself. He was advising others who faced the same moral and practical dilemma he'd confronted, and his answer would influence decisions made in the death zone of the world's tallest mountain. The next 18 hours, Marcus found himself coordinating a rescue effort that would require everything he'd learned about survival psychology, emergency medicine, and the extraordinary capacity of human beings to exceed their apparent limitations. The climbing team consisted of experienced mountaineers from 4 different countries, led by a British expedition leader named David Harrison, who had summited Everest twice before. They'd been climbing during what should have been a stable weather window, but climate patterns in the Himalayas had become increasingly unpredictable in recent years. The injured climbers were Maria Santos, a Brazilian cardiologist attempting her first major peak, and Chun Wei, a Chinese engineer who'd been training for this expedition for 3 years. Santos was suffering from high-altitude cerebral edema, a potentially fatal condition where brain swelling causes confusion, loss of coordination, and eventual coma. Wei had fallen into a crevasse and sustained a fracture that made further climbing impossible. Harrison's dilemma was brutally simple. He could attempt to evacuate both injured climbers, which would require the entire team to abandon their summit attempt and risk all their lives in deteriorating conditions, or he could leave them with emergency supplies and continue upward, hoping rescue helicopters could reach them once the storm passed. Marcus understood the calculation because he'd faced a similar one. The difference was that his choice had involved risking one additional life, his own. Harrison's decision would affect 6 people, each with families, dreams, and futures that hung in the balance. "Tell me about the team's physical condition," Marcus said during his second conversation with Base Camp. He'd spent the morning researching high-altitude rescue protocols and consulting with colleagues who had Himalayan experience. 4 members are still strong, Walsh reported. Harrison has some frostbite on his fingers but nothing incapacitating. The team doctor, Rebecca Foster, is exhausted but functional. 2 clients are borderline. They can continue up, but probably shouldn't be involved in a rescue effort. The dynamics were more complex than Marcus's situation had been. This wasn't one person making an individual choice. It was a group decision with competing interests, professional obligations, and the added pressure of a commercial expedition where clients had paid substantial sums for their summit. Marcus spent the afternoon conferring with high-altitude medicine specialists, rescue coordinators, and even calling Sarah to discuss the psychological factors involved. Her perspective had become invaluable to him, the viewpoint of someone who'd been the person needing rescue, who understood the guilt and responsibility that came with being saved. "What did you think about when you told me to leave you?" Marcus asked her during their phone conversation. "I thought I was being rational," Sarah replied. "Saving your life by sacrificing mine. It felt like the moral choice, the mathematical choice. But I was wrong about what was possible. What if you'd been right? What if Carrie and you had killed us both?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Then at least we would have died trying to do the right thing. I can live with being wrong about the odds. I don't think I could have lived with you abandoning me, even if it had been the smart choice." That conversation crystallized Marcus's advice to the Everest team. When Base Camp called for his final recommendation, Marcus was ready with a response that drew on everything he'd learned about human endurance, team dynamics, and the moral calculations that define us in moments of crisis. "You don't leave anyone behind," he said. "Not if there's any chance of success. The summit will always be there. These people won't." But Marcus's recommendation came with a detailed evacuation plan that addressed the practical challenges Harrison's team would face. Drawing on his own experience with energy management, route selection, and emergency medical care, Marcus outlined a strategy that could maximize their chances of success. The plan involved splitting the team into specialized roles. Harrison and Foster would focus on evacuating Santos, whose cerebral edema required immediate descent to lower altitude. 2 of the stronger clients would assist with Way's evacuation, using techniques Marcus had researched for moving injured climbers across difficult terrain. The remaining team members would break trail and manage equipment, distributing the physical and mental load across the entire group. "The key is accepting that this becomes a different expedition," Marcus explained to Harrison during their final consultation. "You're no longer climbing Everest. You're conducting a technical rescue at extreme altitude. That requires different skills, different decision-making, and different measures of success." The evacuation began at 4:30 a.m. Himalayan time, with Marcus MAINTAININ satellite communication contact throughout the operation. What unfolded over the next 14 hours would test not only the physical capabilities of Harrison's team, but also Marcus's understanding of what human beings could accomplish when they refused to accept the impossible. The parallels to his own experience were both inspiring and terrifying. Like Marcus carrying Sarah through the Colorado blizzard, Harrison's team was attempting something that survival manuals said couldn't be done. They were carrying 2 injured people down technical terrain in deteriorating weather at an altitude where every breath was a struggle and every step required enormous effort. But unlike Marcus's solo carry, this was a coordinated team effort that required constant communication, shared decision-making, and trust among people who'd known each other for only a few weeks. The dynamics were more complex, but they also provided advantages that Marcus hadn't had: multiple sources of strength, diverse skills, and the psychological support that comes from shared adversity. The first major crisis came 6 hours into the evacuation, when Santos's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her cerebral edema was worsening despite the descent, and she was becoming increasingly disoriented and uncooperative. "She's fighting us," Foster reported during an emergency consultation, "trying to walk back up the mountain. We can't restrain her, and continue the evacuation at the same time. Marcus recognized the symptom hypoxic delirium that made patients believe they were in danger from the people trying to help them. He'd seen it in emergency rooms when patients with severe head injuries became combative during treatment. "You need to sedate her," Marcus advised. "Foster should have emergency medications in her kit. Minimal dose, just enough to reduce her agitation without compromising her breathing." The decision to sedate a patient at extreme altitude went against standard protocols, but Marcus understood that standard protocols didn't account for situations like this. Sometimes saving someone required accepting risks that seemed unacceptable under normal circumstances. The sedation worked, allowing the team to continue Santos's evacuation while she remained calm and cooperative. But it also created a new challenge. They were now carrying an unconscious person who couldn't assist with her own movement, making every step more difficult and dangerous. Way's evacuation presented different challenges. His leg fracture was stable, but the pain was excruciating, and moving across the technical terrain required constant repositioning that aggravated his injury. The team improvised a sled system using climbing ropes and equipment, but the improvisation required constant adjustment as conditions changed. 8 hours into the evacuation, Harrison's team faced their own version of Marcus's ravine crossing, a section of glacier where recent seismic activity had opened new crevasses that weren't marked on their maps. The established route was no longer passable, and they had to find an alternative while carrying 2 injured climbers and racing against an approaching storm. "We have 3 possible routes," Harrison reported during an emergency consultation. "All of them involve technical climbing with the injured team members. All of them are beyond what we'd normally attempt under these conditions." Marcus found himself reliving his own critical decision-making moments, understanding the psychological pressure Harrison was experiencing. Every choice carried potentially fatal consequences, but inaction was equally dangerous. "Which route gives you the best margin for error?" Marcus asked. "Don't worry about time or difficulty. Which one has the best backup options if something goes wrong?" The route Harrison chose would add 2 hours to their evacuation, but provided multiple escape possibilities if conditions deteriorated further. It was the kind of conservative decision-making that Marcus had learned during his own survival experience, prioritizing safety margins over speed when lives were at stake. The final phase of the evacuation tested everyone's limits. Storm winds were increasing, temperature was dropping, and fatigue was affecting every team member's performance. Santos remained unconscious but stable, while Way was struggling with hypothermia that threatened to complicate his injury. The team was spread across a quarter-mile of difficult terrain, connected by radio and bound together by their refusal to leave anyone behind. Marcus remained in contact throughout this final push, providing medical guidance and psychological support as the team pushed beyond their apparent capabilities. He understood the mental battle they were fighting, the voice that said they couldn't continue, that the effort was too great, that sacrifice was inevitable. "You're closer than you think," Marcus told Harrison during their last communication, before base camp rescue teams could take over. "Every step is bringing you closer to saving everyone. Don't measure your progress against the mountain, measure it against what you thought was possible when this started." 14 hours and 27 minutes after the evacuation began, Harrison's team reached the pickup point where helicopter rescue was possible. All 6 climbers were alive, though both Santos and Way required immediate medical evacuation to lower altitude. The success of the Everest rescue validated everything Marcus had learned about human resilience and group survival. But it also taught him something new, that his experience with Sarah had given him knowledge that could help others facing similar impossible choices. Over the following months, Marcus found himself consulting on rescue operations around the world. Mountain rescue teams in the Alps, search and rescue coordinators in Alaska, emergency medical services in remote locations, all seeking advice from someone who'd proven that the impossible was sometimes just difficult. Each consultation reinforced the lessons Marcus had learned during his own ordeal. Success in extreme situations required more than physical capability or technical knowledge. It demanded a fundamental belief that human beings could exceed their apparent limitations when the stakes were high enough and the cause was important enough. But perhaps the most important lesson was simpler. In moments of crisis, the choice between self-preservation and helping others wasn't really a choice at all. It was a test of character that revealed who we truly were when everything else was stripped away. The Everest rescue had shown that Marcus's decision to carry Sarah hadn't been an isolated act of heroism. It was part of a fundamental human capacity for courage and sacrifice that existed in ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. The question wasn't whether people could do the impossible, it was whether they would choose to try when the moment came. Standing in his Denver apartment, looking out at the same mountain peaks where his own journey had begun, Marcus understood that his story with Sarah had been just the beginning. Every rescue he consulted on, every impossible decision he helped others navigate, was part of a larger narrative about human resilience and the refusal to leave anyone behind. The storm that had nearly killed them, both had also taught them something profound about the capacity for courage that existed in ordinary people. And that knowledge, shared with others facing their own storms, had become their greatest contribution to the world. 3 years after the storm that defined their lives, Sarah Mitchell stood before a classroom of 43 inner-city teenagers in Detroit, holding a photograph that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their own potential. The image showed a snow-covered mountain peak in Colorado, serene and beautiful in the morning light. But Sarah wasn't here to talk about photography or wilderness adventures. She was here because of a letter she'd received from 16-year-old Jamal Washington, a student at Crockett High School who'd seen their story on social media and written to ask a question that had haunted him for months. "Ms. Mitchell," his letter had read, "you said to leave you there to die, but Dr. Chun wouldn't give up on you. I want to know, what do you do when everyone has already given up on you?" The question had stopped Sarah cold because it forced her to confront something she'd never fully considered: what their story meant to people who weren't facing physical survival, but emotional and social survival in environments just as dangerous as any mountain storm. Jamal's neighborhood had one of the highest crime rates in Detroit. His school had a 47% graduation rate. His father had been in prison since Jamal was 8, and his mother worked 3 jobs to keep them in their 1-bedroom apartment. When Jamal looked around his world, he saw people giving up constantly on education, on family, on the future, on each other. But he also saw something else: people who refused to be left behind, who carried others when they couldn't carry themselves, who believed in possibilities that statistics said didn't exist. Sarah had driven to Detroit not just to answer Jamal's question, but to understand how the lessons from Thunder Lake might apply to challenges that had nothing to do with hypothermia or mountain rescue. "How many of you have ever been told you can't do something?" Sarah asked the classroom, and every hand went up without hesitation. "How many of you have been told you won't amount to anything?" Again, every hand. "How many of you have wanted to give up on something important?" This time the hands rose more slowly, but they all rose. Sarah nodded, understanding. 3 years ago, I was lying in the snow telling someone to leave me there to die. I was convinced that saving me was impossible, that trying would just mean 2 people dying instead of 1. I was wrong about what was possible, but more importantly, I was wrong about what I was worth. She clicked to the next slide, showing the GPS track of Marcus's route through the storm, a zigzagging line that looked chaotic and desperate on the screen. "This is the path someone took to save my life. It wasn't straight, it wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't logical. But it worked because the person carrying me refused to believe that I wasn't worth the effort. In the back of the classroom, Jamal raised his hand. But what if there's nobody to carry you? What if you're the one who has to do the carrying? The question revealed the heart of what Sarah had come to understand about their story's real significance. Marcus hadn't just saved her life. He'd demonstrated something profound about human worth and the responsibility we have to each other. But what happened when you were both the person needing rescue and the person doing the rescuing? Tell me about someone you're carrying, Sarah said to Jamal. The story that emerged over the next 20 minutes would reshape Sarah's understanding of heroism and survival in ways she never expected. Jamal was caring for his 12-year-old sister Kaisha while their mother worked nights at a hospital cleaning service. He made sure she did her homework, walked her to school when the neighborhood was dangerous, and spent his own money from a part-time job to buy her school supplies their mother couldn't afford. But Jamal was also struggling academically, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he was exhausted from responsibilities that would challenge most adults. His grades were suffering, his college prospects were dim, and guidance counselors had suggested he consider vocational training instead of university. I feel like I'm carrying her through a storm, Jamal said, his voice barely audible. But I don't know where we're going, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to make it. Sarah felt the familiar chill of recognition. Jamal was living his own version of the impossible choice: sacrifice his own future to protect his sister, or pursue his education while risking her safety and stability. What if I told you that the storm doesn't last forever? Sarah said. And what if I told you that carrying someone else doesn't make you weaker? It makes you stronger than you ever imagined you could be. Over the following weeks, Sarah began working with Jamal and several other students to develop something unprecedented: a mentorship program that applied wilderness survival principles to urban challenges. The program, which she called No One Left Behind, was based on the insight that many of the psychological and practical skills required for mountain survival were equally relevant to navigating poverty, violence, educational barriers, and family dysfunction. Goal setting and route planning became strategies for academic and career development. Emergency preparedness translated into financial literacy and crisis management. Team dynamics and mutual support became tools for building community resilience. But the most important principle was the one Marcus had demonstrated in the Colorado storm: the refusal to abandon someone, even when conventional wisdom suggested it was the rational choice. Marcus joined the program 6 months later, initially as a medical consultant, but increasingly as a co-developer of their curriculum. His experience as an emergency physician had taught him that many of the patients he treated were victims not of accidents or acute illnesses, but of chronic social conditions that wore people down over time. I see teenagers in my emergency room who remind me of Sarah during the storm, Marcus explained to the program's first group of mentors. They're hypothermic, but not from cold exposure. They're lost, but not in the wilderness. They're telling people to leave them behind because they can't see any other way forward. The program's first major test came during Jamal's senior year, when a series of crises threatened to derail everything he'd worked toward. His mother lost one of her jobs due to budget cuts at the hospital. Their rent increased by 30%, forcing them to consider moving to an even more dangerous neighborhood. Kaisha began struggling in school, requiring additional attention and support that Jamal didn't have time to provide. Most devastating of all, Jamal received a rejection letter from the University of Michigan, his top choice for college. His backup schools had either rejected him or offered minimal financial aid. The path forward that had seemed possible just months earlier now appeared completely blocked. I'm done, Jamal told Sarah during an emergency mentoring session. I can't carry her anymore. I can't carry myself. Maybe it's time to just give up and accept that this is as far as we go. Sarah recognized the moment because she'd lived it herself, the point where continuing seemed not just difficult, but impossible. where surrender felt like the only rational choice. But she also recognized something Jamal couldn't see. He'd already proven his capacity for the impossible. For 4 years, he'd maintained his grades while caring for his sister, worked part-time, while staying involved in school activities, and navigated challenges that would have overwhelmed most people his age. "You're not carrying her," Sarah told him. "You're both carrying each other, and you're both stronger because of it." The solution that emerged required the entire No One Left Behind community working together in ways that mirrored the team. Dynamics Marcus had seen in the Everest Rescue Program alumni, who'd graduated from college, provided tutoring and academic support for Kaisha, removing that burden from Jamal's shoulders. Local business partners offered emergency financial assistance to help with rent, giving the family time to stabilize their situation. Most importantly, Sarah and Marcus leveraged their growing network of contacts to find scholarship opportunities that Jamal's school counselors either didn't know about or didn't think he qualified for. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Manning, the Johns Hopkins researcher who'd studied Marcus and Sarah's case, had established a scholarship fund for students who demonstrated extraordinary resilience in the face of adversity. Jamal's essay about caring for his sister while pursuing his education reminded me why we study survival psychology. Dr. Manning explained when she called to offer him a full scholarship. He's been conducting his own experiment in human endurance for years, and the results prove the same things we learned from your mountain rescue. But Jamal's success was just the beginning of what the program would accomplish. Over the next 2 years, No One Left Behind expanded to 12 schools across Detroit, then to cities nationwide. Students facing challenges ranging from homelessness to gang violence to family addiction found support systems that applied survival principles to urban environments. The program's success rate was unprecedented. 94% of participants graduated from high school, compared to 61% in comparable demographics. 87% enrolled in post-secondary education or training programs. Most remarkably, participants reported decreased anxiety and depression, increased confidence in their problem-solving abilities, and stronger family relationships. But the quantitative results didn't capture the program's most significant impact: the transformation of how young people understood their own potential and responsibility to others. Students who'd felt abandoned by the system learned to identify when others needed help and develop the skills to provide it. Teenagers who'd planned to leave their communities after graduation instead became advocates for change within them. Young people who'd been told they were destined for failure began teaching younger students about resilience and possibility. Sarah documented these changes through her photography, creating a visual record of how the principles of wilderness survival could transform urban communities. Her images showed students tutoring each other, families working together to solve housing crises, teenagers providing leadership during neighborhood emergencies. The photographs told the same story that her images from Thunder Lake had told. When people refused to abandon each other, they could accomplish things that seemed impossible. Marcus continued his emergency medicine practice, but increasingly found himself treating patients who'd been touched by the program. Overdose victims whose friends had learned emergency response techniques. Assault survivors whose family members had developed crisis intervention skills. Teenagers whose mental health crises were managed by peer support networks rather than becoming medical emergencies. "We're not just teaching survival skills," Marcus realized during one of their program evaluations. "We're creating a culture where survival isn't an individual challenge, it's a community responsibility." The program's philosophy attracted attention from social workers, educators, and policymakers who recognized its potential for addressing systemic urban challenges. But Sarah and Marcus remained focused on the individual story students, like Jamal, who'd proven that ordinary people could carry extraordinary loads when they had support and believed in their own worth. 5 years after, Sarah had whispered, Leave me here to die in a Colorado blizzard. She stood at Jamal's college graduation ceremony, watching him receive his degree in social work. His sister Kaysa, now a high school senior herself, sat with their mother in the audience wearing a University of Michigan t-shirt. Her acceptance letter had arrived the previous week. During his graduation speech as class valedictorian, Jamal referenced a lesson he'd learned from a photographer and a doctor who'd survived an impossible storm. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to leave someone behind, he said. But sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is let someone carry you until you're strong enough to walk on your own. After the ceremony, as Sarah hugged Jamal and congratulated his family, she understood that their story had evolved far beyond a tale of physical survival. It had become a blueprint for emotional and social survival, a demonstration that the same principles that worked in mountain rescues could work in urban environments where the storms were social rather than meteorological. The young man who'd once asked what to do when everyone had given up on you had found his answer. You found people who refused to give up, and then you became one of those people for someone else. Standing there in the Detroit sunshine, surrounded by families celebrating achievements that statistics said were impossible, Sarah realized that Thunder Lake had taught them more than how to survive a blizzard. It had taught them how to create communities where no one was left behind, where carrying each other was seen not as a burden but as the foundation of human strength. The storm that had nearly killed them both had ultimately saved far more lives than just their own. The phone call that would test everything Marcus and Sarah had built came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, exactly 5 years after their survival in the Colorado storm. Dr. Rebecca Foster, the teen doctor from the Everest rescue, was calling from a hospital in Kathmandu with news that would challenge the very foundations of their beliefs about human resilience. "Marcus, we lost him." Foster's voice cracked through the satellite connection. David Harrison, the expedition leader who saved everyone on Everest, he took his own life yesterday. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Harrison had become more than a consulting client. He'd become a friend and collaborator, someone who understood the weight of making life or death decisions for others. His successful leadership during the Himalayan rescue had led to speaking engagements, a book deal, and recognition as one of the world's foremost experts on high-altitude survival. "I don't understand," Marcus said, fully awake now and reaching for his laptop to book the first flight to Nepal. He was doing so well with everything. "That's what everyone thought," Foster replied. But his wife found journals going back 2 years. He'd been struggling with what he called survivor's weight, the psychological burden of being responsible for other people's lives. He felt like he was carrying everyone he'd ever saved, and it was crushing him. The revelation forced Marcus to confront something he'd never fully acknowledged about his own experience. The physical challenge of carrying Sarah through the storm had lasted only hours, but the psychological weight of that decision had never really ended. Every rescue consultation, every speaking engagement, every time someone thanked him for saving their life indirectly through his advice, it all accumulated into a pressure that was both invisible and overwhelming. Sarah met Marcus at Denver International Airport 18 hours later, her own face reflecting the shock and confusion they both felt. Harrison's death challenged everything they thought they understood about the relationship between survival, heroism, and mental health. "How do we process this?" Sarah asked as they waited for their connecting flight to Kathmandu. "How do we help others survive impossible situations when we can't even help someone who is supposed to be thriving?" The question would drive them to investigate aspects of survival psychology that research had barely begun to address: the long-term mental health consequences of extreme survival experiences, the psychological burden carried by people who save others, and the hidden costs of being perceived as heroes. Their journey to Nepal wasn't just about paying respects to Harrison. It was about understanding how someone who demonstrated Extraordinary courage and leadership could ultimately be defeated not by external circumstances, but by internal struggles that no one recognized or addressed. Harrison's wife, Claire, met them at the hotel in Kathmandu, with a box of journals that painted a devastating picture of psychological deterioration hidden behind public success. "He started writing these about 6 months after Everest," Claire explained, her voice hollow with grief and exhaustion. "At first, they were just reflections on the rescue, processing what had happened. But gradually they became something darker." The early entries were familiar to both Marcus and Sarah, detailed analysis of decisions made under pressure, second-guessing choices that had ultimately saved lives, wondering what would have happened if circumstances had been slightly different. But as the journals progressed, Harrison's writing revealed a psychological spiral that neither his family nor colleagues had recognized. He'd begun experiencing intrusive thoughts about all the rescues he'd been involved in throughout his climbing career. He calculated the statistical probability that his luck would eventually run out, that a future decision would result in preventable deaths. Most troubling of all, he'd developed what psychologists call hypervigilance, a state of constant alertness for emergency situations that had begun consuming his daily life. He couldn't watch movies involving rescue scenarios, couldn't read news stories about accidents without experiencing panic attacks, couldn't even go hiking with his family without compulsively planning escape routes for imaginary disasters. He became convinced that every person he saved was temporarily borrowed time, Claire read from one of the final entries. He felt responsible not just for getting them through immediate crises, but for protecting them from all future harm. When he couldn't do that, when people he'd saved later experienced other tragedies, he interpreted it as personal failure. Marcus recognized symptoms he'd experienced himself, but had never connected to his rescue of Sarah: the hypervigilance during medical emergencies that went beyond normal professional concern, the compulsive checking of weather reports whenever Sarah mentioned outdoor photography assignments, the way he'd unconsciously positioned himself between potential dangers and other people in everyday situations. "We need to understand what happened to him," Marcus told Claire. "Not just for David's memory, but because there might be others experiencing the same thing." What they discovered over the next week in Nepal would revolutionize how the medical and rescue communities understood the psychological aftermath of extreme survival situations. Working with Dr. Foster and local mental health professionals, Marcus and Sarah began interviewing other members of the Everest rescue team, as well as professional guides and rescue workers who'd been involved in high-stakes survival situations. The pattern that emerged was both clear and alarming. A significant percentage of people who'd been responsible for saving others in extreme circumstances developed long-term psychological symptoms that weren't being recognized or treated by existing mental health frameworks. "We have diagnostic criteria for PTSD in people who've experienced trauma," explained Dr. Pemba Sherpa, a Nepali psychiatrist who specialized in treating climbing-related psychological injuries. "But we don't have adequate frameworks for understanding the mental health impact on people who've been responsible for preventing trauma in others." The condition that Harrison had experienced, and that Marcus was beginning to recognize in himself, wasn't traditional post-traumatic stress. It was something more complex, a form of anticipatory anxiety, combined with survivor guilt and an overwhelming sense of ongoing responsibility that persisted long after the original crisis had ended. Sarah's perspective, as someone who'd been saved, rather than someone who'd done the saving, provided crucial insights into the psychological dynamics involved. "I spent months feeling guilty that Marcus had risked his life for me," she told the research team. "But I never considered that he might be spending years feeling responsible for protecting me from every subsequent danger I might face." The interviews revealed that this psychological burden was particularly acute among people whose rescue work had received public attention. The combination of being perceived as Heroes, while privately struggling with anxiety and hypervigilance, created an isolation that was difficult to address through conventional therapeutic approaches. These are people who've proven they can handle impossible situations, Dr. Foster observed. Admitting that they're struggling with the aftermath feels like admitting weakness, which contradicts their entire identity. Marcus found himself opening up about his own experiences for the first time, describing the constant low-level anxiety that had colored his life since the Thunder Lake rescue. Every time Sarah goes on a photography assignment, part of me is still carrying her through that storm, he admitted during one of the research sessions. I know intellectually that she's capable and careful, but emotionally, I feel responsible for her safety in ways that go far beyond normal friendship. The research expanded to include other high-profile rescue survivors and their rescuers. The pattern held across different types of emergencies: firefighters who'd saved people from building collapses, lifeguards who'd prevented drownings, emergency medical personnel who'd resuscitated cardiac arrest patients. In each case, the people who'd been saved generally recovered psychologically more quickly than the people who'd done the saving. The rescued individuals experienced gratitude, renewed appreciation for life, and often increased resilience. The rescuers experienced ongoing anxiety, hypervigilance, and what researchers began calling perpetual responsibility syndrome. It's as if the act of saving someone creates a psychological bond that doesn't end when the immediate danger passes, Dr. Sherpa explained. The rescuer continues to feel accountable for that person's well-being indefinitely. The findings had profound implications for how rescue organizations, emergency services, and military units prepared their personnel for the psychological aftermath of successful operations. But they also suggested interventions that could help people like Harrison, if the condition had been recognized before it became overwhelming. Working with the research team, Marcus and Sarah developed a protocol they called Rescue Recovery, a structured program for helping people process the psychological impact of being responsible for others' survival. The program involved peer support groups where rescuers could discuss their ongoing concerns without judgment, cognitive behavioral therapy specifically designed to address hypervigilance and excessive responsibility, and practical strategies for maintaining appropriate boundaries between professional rescue work and personal relationships. Most importantly, it normalized the idea that feeling ongoing responsibility for people you've saved wasn't a character flaw or professional weakness. It was a predictable psychological response that could be managed with appropriate support. The first pilot program was launched at Denver General Hospital, where Marcus worked with emergency department staff who'd been involved in high-stakes resuscitations. The results were immediately encouraging. Participants reported decreased anxiety, improved sleep, and better work-life boundaries. That Sarah contributed by documenting the program through photography and video, creating materials that could help other rescue professionals understand they weren't alone in their experiences. But the most powerful validation came from an unexpected source: participants in their No One Left Behind youth program, who'd recognized similar patterns in their own lives. Jamal Washington, now a graduate student in social work, had experienced his own version of perpetual responsibility syndrome while caring for his sister and other students in their community. I realized I was carrying everyone I'd ever helped, Jamal explained during one of their program evaluation sessions. Every time someone I'd mentored faced a new challenge, I felt like it was my job to solve it. I was burning out trying to be responsible for other people's entire lives instead of just helping them through specific crises. The insight led to an expansion of the rescue recovery protocol to include community workers, teachers, social workers, and others whose roles involved ongoing responsibility for vulnerable populations. The program's success attracted international attention, leading to implementation in rescue organizations across 6 countries. But Marcus and Sarah remained focused on the individual stories, people like Harrison who'd been struggling alone with burdens they didn't know how to share. 6 months after Harrison's death, they returned to Nepal for a memorial ceremony at Everest Base Camp. Claire, Harrison had asked them to scatter some of David's ashes at the site, where he'd made the decision to save his entire team, rather than pursue the summit, standing at 17,600 feet, surrounded by mountains that had witnessed countless acts of courage and tragedy. Marcus finally understood something Harrison had written in his final journal entries. "The mountain doesn't care whether you're a hero or a coward," Harrison had written. "It only cares whether you're still breathing." But humans need more than survival. They need meaning, purpose, and the knowledge that their struggles matter to someone else. The memorial service included not just Harrison's family and climbing colleagues, but also Maria Santos and Chun Wei, the 2 climbers whose lives he'd saved during the Everest rescue. Both had struggled with their own survivor guilt, but both had also channeled their gratitude into meaningful actions. Santos had established a foundation, providing emergency medical training to remote communities in Brazil. Wei had become a safety instructor for Chinese mountaineering expeditions. Their efforts to honor Harrison's sacrifice by helping others had become part of their own psychological healing. "David saved our lives," Santos said during the ceremony. "But he also taught us that being saved creates a responsibility to help others. We can't bring him back, but we can make sure his example continues to save lives." As they scattered Harrison's ashes into the wind above the Himalayas, Marcus understood that their own story had evolved once again. It was no longer just about surviving the storm or even about helping others survive their own storms. It was about creating support systems that could sustain the people who dedicate their lives to saving others, the mountain that had nearly claimed Harrison's life had also taught him, and now them, that true heroism wasn't about single acts of courage under extreme circumstances. It was about the ongoing choice to carry others through their struggles while finding ways to share the weight of that responsibility. Harrison's tragedy had become the foundation for helping countless others avoid the same fate. His death, devastating as it was, had revealed a hidden crisis affecting rescue workers worldwide, and had led to solutions that would save lives for generations to come. Standing together at the roof of the world, Marcus and Sarah made a commitment that would guide the rest of their work. No one who saved others would be left to carry that weight alone. The principles they'd learned in the Colorado storm, that survival was a shared responsibility and that everyone was worth the effort to save, would now extend to protecting the protectors themselves. 7 years after the storm that changed everything, Sarah Mitchell found herself standing in the most unlikely place imaginable, the boardroom of Titan Industries, a Fortune 500 company in Manhattan, presenting to executives who controlled billions in annual revenue and had never spent a night outdoors in their lives. The invitation had come through Dr. Elizabeth Manning, whose research on survival psychology had caught the attention of corporate leadership consultants seeking new approaches to crisis management and team resilience. But Sarah suspected the real reason she was here had less to do with business strategy and more to do with a crisis that had rocked the company 6 months earlier. Titan's CEO, Robert Lancaster, had suffered a massive heart attack during a board meeting while the company was facing a hostile takeover attempt. His collapse had triggered a leadership vacuum that nearly destroyed a company employing over 40,000 people worldwide. The experience had left the surviving executives questioning everything they thought they knew about decision-making under pressure and the responsibilities leaders bear for the people who depend on them. "Ms. Mitchell," Lancaster said from his seat at the head of the conference table, his voice still carrying the slight breathlessness that remained from his cardiac event. "We've read about your wilderness survival program and Dr. Chin's rescue protocols. But I have to ask, what does carrying someone through a blizzard have to do with corporate leadership?" Sarah had anticipated the question. But the answer she was about to give would surprise everyone in the room, including herself. "Mr. Lancaster, when you collapsed in this boardroom, what was the first thing your colleagues did?" Lancaster looked confused. "They called 911, obviously." "Actually," Sarah said, consulting the incident report she'd requested in advance, "the first thing they did was argue about who had the authority to call for help. It took 4 minutes and 17 seconds before anyone actually dialed emergency services. During those 4 minutes, you were clinically dead." The room fell silent. Sarah had everyone's attention now, but she could see discomfort and defensiveness in several faces around the table. "That delay happened because your corporate structure doesn't prepare leaders to make life or death decisions for each other. You're excellent at managing quarterly projections and market analysis, but when faced with an actual crisis requiring immediate action, your training failed." What Sarah didn't mention was the real reason she'd accepted this consulting contract. 3 weeks earlier, she'd received a letter from Amanda Lancaster, Robert's daughter, who worked as a junior analyst in the company's sustainability division. Amanda's letter had been devastating in its honesty. She described watching her father's collapse from across the boardroom, seeing executives she'd respected her entire life freeze in panic while her father's life hung in the balance. She'd been the one who finally called 911, but only after pushing past senior vice presidents who were debating corporate liability and chain of command procedures. "I keep thinking about your story with Dr. Chun," Amanda had written. "How he just acted when you needed help without thinking about rules or protocols or what it might cost him. I work with people who spend more time analyzing the decision to order lunch than my father's colleagues spent trying to save his life." The letter had revealed something Sarah hadn't expected to find in corporate America: young professionals hungry for leadership models that prioritized human welfare over bureaucratic procedures. People who wanted to work for organizations that would actually take care of them when crisis struck. Now facing a room full of executives who controlled the careers and livelihoods of thousands of employees, Sarah realized she was looking at a different kind of rescue situation. The principles that govern survival in extreme environments apply directly to organizational leadership, she continued. But most corporate cultures actively discourage the kind of thinking that saves lives when everything goes wrong. Over the next 3 hours, Sarah walked the Titan executives through scenarios that challenged their fundamental assumptions about leadership, decision-making, and responsibility. She described Marcus's split-second decision to carry her through the storm, emphasizing how he'd acted on incomplete information without waiting for perfect data or consulting higher authorities. She analyzed the Everest rescue David Harrison had led, showing how traditional command structures had been abandoned in favor of flexible teams that prioritized mission success over hierarchy. But the most powerful part of her presentation focused on the psychological dynamics that separated effective crisis leaders from those who failed under pressure. "When Marcus decided to carry me, he didn't conduct a risk-benefit analysis," Sarah explained. "He didn't form a committee or seek consensus. He identified someone who needed help, determined he could provide it, and acted immediately." Corporate cultures that punish individual initiative and require multiple approvals for basic decisions are literally training their leaders to fail when seconds matter. The questions that followed revealed just how foreign these concepts were to most of the executives present. "But what about liability?" asked the general counsel. "If someone takes unauthorized action that results in injury or damage, the company could face enormous lawsuits. What's the liability cost of letting someone die while you're deciding who has the authority to help them?" Sarah responded. "What's the market impact when your employees realize that your company values legal protection more than human life?" The discussion grew heated as executives struggled to reconcile their training and risk management with Sarah's arguments for immediate action in crisis situations. Some participants were openly skeptical, questioning whether military-style decision-making could work in complex business environments. But others, particularly younger executives like Amanda Lancaster, were energized by the possibility of creating organizational cultures that could respond effectively to unexpected challenges. The breakthrough came when Sarah introduced a simulation exercise based on a real emergency that had occurred at another Fortune 500 company the previous year. At 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, a software engineer at Tech Global noticed unusual patterns in their customer database that suggested a massive cyber attack was in progress. Sarah began. Customer financial information for over 2 million people was potentially compromised. The discovery required immediate action, shutting down servers, notifying customers, coordinating with law enforcement, and implementing crisis communication protocols. She paused, studying the faces around the table. The engineer who discovered the breach was a 26-year-old recent graduate with no management authority. According to standard protocols, she should have reported to her supervisor, who would have escalated to department management, who would have briefed senior executives, who would have consulted with legal and public relations before taking action. "That's exactly right," said the chief technology officer. "Chain of command exists for good reasons. You can't have junior employees making decisions that affect the entire company." The attack was designed to extract maximum data in a 6-hour window, Sarah continued. Following standard protocols would have taken at least 4 hours just to reach decision-makers with authority to act. By then, irreversible damage would have been done. She clicked to the next slide, showing a timeline of the actual response. The engineer bypassed all protocols. She immediately shut down the compromised servers, sent direct alerts to the CEO and security team, and began implementing containment procedures she wasn't authorized to execute. Her actions limited the breach to less than 1,000 customer records and prevented what could have been a company-ending disaster. "And was she disciplined for violating procedures?" asked the general counsel. "She was promoted to head of cybersecurity," Sarah replied, "because Tech Global's leadership recognized that their survival had depended on someone willing to act decisively without permission." The room fell quiet as the implications sank in. Sarah could see executives reconsidering their own organizational structures, wondering how many potential disasters had been allowed to escalate because employees were afraid to act without authorization. But the real transformation began during the role-playing exercises that followed. Sarah divided the executives into teams and presented them with crisis scenarios that required immediate decision-making. A chemical spill threatening a manufacturing facility, a hostile workplace violence incident, a supply chain disruption that could shut down operations, a social media crisis spiraling out of control. Each scenario was timed, with consequences escalating rapidly as teams struggled to navigate their own corporate hierarchies and decision-making processes. The results were sobering. Teams that followed standard protocols consistently failed to respond quickly enough to prevent serious damage. Teams that were willing to bypass normal procedures and empower individual initiative achieved better outcomes, but only after overcoming deep-seated reluctance to act without explicit authorization. "This is frustrating," admitted the chief financial officer after his team's third consecutive failure to respond effectively to a simulated crisis. "I know what needs to be done, but I keep hesitating because I'm not sure I have the authority to do it." "That hesitation," Sarah said, "is exactly what nearly killed your CEO. It's what causes good people to stand by while preventable disasters unfold. And it's what creates organizational cultures where survival depends on luck rather than leadership." The workshop's climax came when Sarah introduced the concept of distributed authority, organizational structures that pre-authorized employees at all levels to take specific emergency actions without waiting for approval, drawing on military and emergency service models. She outlined how companies could maintain normal hierarchical control while creating parallel systems that activated during crisis situations. Every employee should know exactly what they're authorized to do when standard procedures would cause dangerous delays, Sarah explained. Not just senior executives, but everyone who might be first to recognize an emergency. The resistance was immediate and intense. "You're asking us to give up control," protested the chief operating officer. "To trust people with limited experience. To make decisions that could affect the entire company. I'm asking you to trust people with their own survival and the survival of their colleagues," Sarah replied. The same trust Marcus showed when he decided I was worth saving, even though he'd known me for exactly one conversation. The debate continued for hours, touching on liability concerns, insurance implications, regulatory compliance, and investor relations. But gradually, a consensus began to emerge around a fundamental question. What kind of organization did they want to be when everything went wrong? By the end of the day, Titan Industries had committed to a pilot program implementing Sarah's crisis. Leadership protocols in 3 divisions. Employees would receive training in emergency decision-making, clear authority guidelines for crisis situations, and psychological support for dealing with the stress of increased responsibility. But the most significant change was cultural. The company began recognizing and rewarding employees who demonstrated initiative during challenging situations, rather than punishing those who deviated from standard procedures when circumstances demanded it. 6 months later, the new protocols were tested during a product recall that could have destroyed the company's reputation and market position. A quality control inspector discovered a manufacturing defect that made one of Titan's consumer products potentially dangerous. Instead of following normal reporting procedures that would have taken days to reach decision makers, she immediately halted production, notified all distribution partners, and initiated customer notifications. Her actions prevented potential injuries and demonstrated the company's commitment to customer safety. What could have been a liability nightmare became a public relations success that actually strengthened customer trust. "She saved our company the same way Dr. Chun saved your life," Robert Lancaster told Sarah during a follow-up consultation. "By acting immediately when action was needed, without worrying about whether she had permission to do the right thing." The Titan case study became a model for other organizations, seeking to build more resilient and responsive corporate cultures. But for Sarah, it represented something more profound, proof that the principles learned during their survival ordeal could create positive change in any environment where people's welfare depended on collective action. The corporate world, she realized, was full of people carrying heavy loads responsibility for employees, customers, stakeholders, and communities. Like Marcus in the storm, they needed frameworks for making difficult decisions under pressure and support systems for managing the psychological weight of those decisions, but most importantly, they needed permission to prioritize human welfare over bureaucratic procedures when the stakes were high enough. Standing in the Titan boardroom where Robert Lancaster had nearly died because of procedural delays, Sarah understood that their story had evolved once again. It was no longer just about wilderness survival or even urban resilience programs. It was about creating cultures of mutual responsibility in every environment where people depended on each other for their safety and welfare. The storm that had nearly killed them both had taught lessons that could save lives in boardrooms as well as on mountains, in corporate crises as well as natural disasters. The question wasn't whether people were capable of heroic action when others needed help. It was whether organizations would create the conditions that allowed and encouraged that heroism to emerge. Amanda Lancaster, now promoted to lead Titan's new Crisis Leadership Division, captured it perfectly in her final presentation to the board. "We used to measure success by how well we followed procedures. Now we measure it by how effectively we take care of each other when procedures aren't enough." 10 years after the storm that redefined their understanding of human potential, Marcus Chun and Sarah Mitchell stood together at the dedication ceremony for the Harrison Institute for Crisis Leadership, built on a mountainside overlooking the very trail where their journey had begun. The building itself was a testament to everything they'd learned about survival and mutual support design, with multiple redundant systems, emergency protocols that prioritized human safety over bureaucratic procedure, and spaces specifically created for processing the psychological aftermath of crisis situations. But the real significance of this moment wasn't the physical structure, or even the programs it would house. It was the recognition that their story had become something larger than either of them had ever imagined, a blueprint for how human beings could support each other through impossible circumstances, not just in wilderness emergencies, but in every sphere of life where survival depended on collective action. The crowd gathered for the dedication included faces from every chapter of their decade-long journey. Jamal Washington, now Dr. Washington, had flown in from Atlanta, where he directed a national network of urban resilience programs. Maria Santos and Chen Wei, the climbers saved during the Everest rescue, represented the international community of mountaineers who'd implemented new safety protocols based on their experiences. Amanda Lancaster, who'd revolutionized corporate crisis management at Titan Industries, brought a delegation of business leaders committed to organizational cultures that valued human welfare above all else. Even Claire Harrison was there, carrying a wooden box containing soil from locations around the world where her late husband's leadership principles had been applied to save lives, from corporate boardrooms to inner-city schools to remote rescue stations. But perhaps the most meaningful presence was Dr. Rebecca Foster, who'd traveled from Nepal specifically to announce the establishment of the first peer support network for rescue professionals, funded by royalties from the book Marcus and Sarah had finally agreed to publish about their experiences. "When we started this journey," Sarah said during her dedication speech, "we thought we were just trying to survive a storm. We had no idea we were developing principles that could help others survive storms of every kind." The statistics she shared told only part of the story. Over the past decade, programs based on their survival principles have been implemented in 37 countries. Emergency response times had improved by an average of 43% in organizations that adopted distributed authority models. Graduation rates in participating urban schools had increased by 26%. Corporate crisis management effectiveness had improved by 61% among companies that prioritized immediate human welfare over procedural compliance. But numbers couldn't capture the individual transformations that had occurred when people discovered they were capable of more than they'd ever imagined. Marcus spoke about the evolution of his own understanding, from a doctor who'd acted on instinct during a medical emergency to someone who'd learned that the same principles could guide decision-making in countless other situations. "I used to think that carrying Sarah through the storm was about physical strength and determination," he said. "I understand now that it was about something much more fundamental, the choice to believe that every person is worth whatever effort it takes to keep them safe." The choice, he'd learned, was one that faced everyone regularly, not just in dramatic emergencies, but in everyday decisions about how much responsibility to accept for others' welfare, how much personal risk to accept for collective benefit, and how much faith to place in human potential when circumstances seemed impossible. The Institute's first initiative would be training programs for what they called everyday heroes: teachers, social workers, healthcare providers, managers, parents, and community leaders who faced their own versions of impossible choices in their daily work. These were people carrying others through storms that weren't visible on weather maps: poverty, addiction, mental illness, educational barriers, workplace crises, family dysfunction, and social isolation. Like Marcus carrying Sarah, they often felt alone in their efforts and uncertain whether their strength would be sufficient for the challenges they faced. The goal isn't to create more heroes, Sarah explained to the gathered audience. It's to help people recognize the heroic capacity they already possess and give them tools for sustaining that capacity over time without burning out. The Institute's research division would focus on questions that had emerged from their decade of experience. How could organizations identify potential heroes before crises occurred? What psychological support did people need to maintain their willingness to help others over extended periods? How could communities create cultures where mutual aid was seen as normal rather than exceptional? But the Institute's most ambitious program was designed for young people like Jamal had been individuals facing seemingly insurmountable circumstances who needed to understand that their current situation didn't define their ultimate potential. The Pau d'Anza, No One Left Behind curriculum had evolved into a comprehensive life skills program that taught practical survival techniques, alongside psychological resilience training. Participants learned everything from financial literacy and conflict resolution to emergency medical care and crisis communication. More importantly, they learned that seeking help was a sign of strength rather than weakness, and that accepting support from others created opportunities to provide support in return. Dr. Washington's research had shown that program participants were 73% more likely to complete their educational goals, 49% more likely to maintain stable employment, and 61% more likely to provide volunteer service in their communities. The program works because it changes how young people see themselves and their responsibilities to each other, Washington explained during the dedication ceremony. Instead of feeling like victims of circumstances beyond their control, they learn to see themselves as potential rescuers who just need the right training and support. As the ceremony concluded, Marcus and Sarah found themselves alone for a few minutes on the observation deck that overlooked Thunder Lake, the site where their story had begun exactly 10 years earlier. The trail below was busy with hikers enjoying perfect October weather, many of them carrying emergency equipment and communication devices that hadn't existed during their ordeal. New weather monitoring systems provided real-time updates to anyone with a smartphone. Rescue teams trained in protocols that had been developed based on lessons learned from their experience and others like it. "Do you think we've made it safer?" Sarah asked, watching a family with young children working their way up the trail. With careful preparation and obvious respect for the mountain environment, "We've made it more survivable," Marcus replied. "Not just the wilderness, but everything else too. We've shown people that impossible situations become possible when you refuse to give up on each other." They'd received thousands of letters over the years from people who'd applied principles learned from their story to challenges ranging from terminal illnesses to business failures to family crises. The common thread wasn't dramatic rescue scenarios, but rather the quiet daily choice to keep carrying others when conventional wisdom suggested they should. Focus on self-preservation. A teacher who'd spent her own money to provide food for hungry students. A manager who'd risked his career to protect employees from workplace harassment. A teenager who'd walked her elderly neighbor to medical appointments for 3 years. A community organizer who'd worked 18-hour days to prevent the closure of a neighborhood health clinic. These were the real heroes. Their story had inspired people who'd learned that the heroism wasn't about dramatic gestures during extreme emergencies, but about the sustained choice to prioritize others' welfare alongside their own. As the sun set behind the peaks that had nearly claimed their lives, Marcus and Sarah understood that their journey was far from over. The Institute would continue their work for decades to come, but the principles they'd discovered were already spreading through countless communities, organizations, and individuals who'd learned that survival was ultimately a collective responsibility. Storm that had brought them together had taught them that human beings were capable of far more than they typically demanded of themselves. But it had also taught them that realizing that potential required communities and cultures that supported and sustained heroic action rather than treating it as an impossible exception. The next storm is always coming, Sarah said, watching. The first stars appear in the darkening sky. But now there are more people ready to carry each other through it. Marcus nodded, thinking about all the rescue workers who'd received psychological support through programs they'd helped develop, all the students who'd graduated because someone refused to let them drop out, all the organizations that had learned to prioritize human welfare over bureaucratic convenience. Their story had become proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they had the right support, training, and most importantly, the unshakable belief that everyone was worth the effort it took to keep them safe. Standing together on the mountain that had tested them and shaped them, they understood that the real measure of their survival wasn't that they'd lived through an impossible storm. It was that they'd used that experience to help others discover their own capacity for courage, resilience, and the fundamental human commitment to never leave anyone behind. The storm had ended years ago, but its lessons would continue saving lives for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.